We're looking at the Rave Generation VA-1000, and as the name says, it's made for rave sounds and it's virtual analog. That means compared to other synthesizers, this thing has more detailed settings regarding the way virtual analog is generated here. And compared to other synthesizers, the sounds in there are really focused on rave. So let's hear a few. These are all leads, but here's also a kick, and here are some more sounds. So they sound good, but they all focus on rave. And for my taste, there's a little bit too much reverb on most of them. It's probably characteristic for hardstyle or harder rave sounds, and the DJ Restyle, who is the owner of Rave Generation, is popular in these genres. But the question for a buyer is probably, how close can I get to some of those Roland sounds with this? And it doesn't only remind of a Roland synthesizer by the look, it also has a lot of Roland typical features. For example, there is a JP8000 style U-saw waveform, but let's get to default sound first, which makes things simple. And the advertising says that the VCO has a dual core oscillator, but when you look at it, you have just one oscillator section, and then there are lots of faders of sound sources that you can mix in. So for example, this is saw, this is pulse, and there is also this super saw called U-saw here, and this is a unison saw, and the settings for it are here. This is the ultra saw unison with spread and mix parameters, but you can also add saw and pulse here and then detune them. While the advertising says it's detuning in semitones, it's much finer here with 2 digits behind the dot. And there's also a separate unison for saw and pulse here. So it's quite easy from a very simple default sound to get a fat VCO sound. And there is also a distinction between FM and phase modulation, which is the typical DX7 style FM Yamaha is famous for, linear phase modulation. And this is quite hidden because you can switch between FM type here, but it doesn't really tell you what you've chosen after you switch this. And on top of this, sometimes the ring mod fader also determines some FM intensity, and there's also an FM amount knob here. So I find this rather confusing and not so easy to understand what's really going on with the FM. There are many more options. For example, if you put oscillator sync into different modes, which you can choose here, then the ring mod also gets a different meaning. So when I turn down FM and I turn this to off and turn up FM type, turn up ring mod, then I can hear something which is not too difficult to understand. But if I go in here or here, things get really confusing and difficult to understand from the brain, while on the other hand, it's not necessary to understand this all, because you can just adjust the knobs and see if you like the sound or not. And that's similar with some of the other options in this synthesizer. There are lots of options. They're not all easy to totally understand, but they are kind of easy to handle. For example, with a VCO, let's get back to a default sound here. You have a chord option. So that's quite interesting. And then you also have legato, portamento, and mono or poly mode. And then in the filter section, there are different filters in here. But on top of this, there's also a high pass without resonance on the right. And then on top of this, there's also drive. And you can choose if the filter or the drive are pre or post, which makes a big difference. So let's set it post. Sorry. And then you can also see that this mix knob, which is really hidden, determines whether you hear something from this drive or not. And then you have an LFO here, and the LFO can be modulating different goals like PWM depth or pitch you saw, which you change here with LFO destination, and you can change the waveform. But there's only one rate here. So the rate will be or you only have one LFO at all, and the rate also affects another LFO, which you can't see here. So, for example, if I take something we can easily hear for the effect, let's use the amp. And turn down the depth. You can still use the mod wheel. And the mod wheel, sorry, it's too slow now. If I turn up the mod wheel, there is another LFO you can hear, even though depth is low. But the rate of this LFO will also affect the LFO modulation that I tune in via the mod wheel. But if you want some other modulation with a different speed, there is also PWM FM up here, which you can see here. Maybe I play an example, go back to default again. My mod wheel is still up, and I turn up pulse. And here's my PWM. So now let's look at the effects. I can turn up a chorus, and there are various modes like a Boss CE300 or a JP8000 or a Alpha Uno 2. And then there's also the option to widen the sound here in the utilities, or to use an over-the-top compressor, or to use a 3-band EQ with bass, treble and mids. Hard to see here in the middle. And then there's also delay and reverb. And this reverb also has a ducking effect. And here is an additional delay. I can make this reverb a little shorter, but There's a certain sound to it, which you can hear now, and that should be it for this short overview of the VA-1000. Compared to other synthesizers on the market, there are maybe a little bit more of detailed options for the virtual analog synthesis, but they are not always easy to understand. They are easy to adjust though, and it's all focused on rave sounds, but it is capable definitely of much more if you put your hands on it and try to make your own sounds. Cheers!